My name is Nidesh Lawtoo, and it is really a pleasure to see so many familiar faces, new faces, and to be joining forces in order to be promoting what we've been calling a mimetic turn, which is central to the Homo Mimeticus project, or also known as HOME. And I must say, it has been quite a journey across countries, languages, and especially disciplines. 5 years, a 5-year project funded by the ERC very generously. And I think more or less 15 years of preparation leading up to the ERC grant. So it has been a total of 20 years struggling with this protean problematic of mimesis. And it feels we are closer to home. It feels like it. I share that with my son, who is 12 years old, and he had to cross the countries for numerous times. So he has been on the move, and he's a fanatic of the Odyssey, 12 years old, and we have an illustrated version. And when I told him that I've been on the move for 20 years, he reminded me that that's more or less the same time that Ulysses is away from home. So it is quite a journey. I'm not claiming that it has been an odyssey, but a journey. And a journey is made of unpredictable events. Some of them catastrophic and unexpected. Global pandemic that hit us in the middle of the project. We are still in it as I speak, and we are receiving some emails, unfortunately, from some of the speakers who are infected with COVID. So I think it's the safe thing still to hold the meeting online, even though we would have preferred, of course, an in-person meeting. And now a war, a horrible war that was very difficult to foresee just 50 days ago, 54 days in war. So I hope you're all safe, for those of you who are on the east side of the country. And if you notice the colors of our programs, they're indeed the colors of the Ukrainian flag, in order to remember that while we are thinking about this problematic of mimesis, we are not forgetting what is happening in the real world. So a journey that both in its catastrophic aspects, but also in its positive encounters, because when one is traveling, one has the occasion to encounter helpers and supporters and friends, many of you present here, who have been encouraging us and giving us tools to analyze this problematic of mimesis. And so on both the pathological and the logical side of Homo Mimeticus, I think that one point is clear, and that point was present from the very beginning of our project. That is the realization that humans are not only rational, autonomous, sapient creatures, as the notion of Homo sapiens a bit narcissistically indicates. I think that myth of the autonomous subject, rational subject, Cartesian subject has been quite exploded in the past 5 years, but well before it. Humans are not only maker of tools, even though we are always getting better at that as well. We are not only economic creatures driven by wanting to possess and greed, even though that is also something that is central. So we are not only Homo sapiens, Homo faber, Homo economicus, we are also creatures who imitate, often unconsciously, for good and ill. And that is what we've been calling Homo Mimeticus. So I think your presence today, so numerous for a conference on mimesis, indicate or supports our hypothesis, which has been that a mimetic turn or a return of attention to a different conception of mimesis is taking place, taking root in different areas of critical theory. And from a plurality of perspectives, we've often joked within the Homo Mimeticus team that there are different ways of pronouncing mimesis. I'm now conforming to the English version due to the language we use, but if you're a classicist, you will go for mimesis, and we'll have some classicists to start with. If you're German or French, it's mimesis. I see some French faces, and it's mimesis. And we welcome this plurality because I think it makes resonate the differences at play in this concept that is very often reduced to sameness. One of the fundamental assumptions of the Homo Mimeticus project has been that if this concept of mimesis generates a quarrel, an ancient quarrel between philosophy and the arts or literature, Plato and Homer to be specific, as my references to the Odyssey already indicate, that quarrel is a quarrel which is not one, because if one looks a little bit closely at the Platonic text, one notices that it's written in mimetic form, in a mimetic lexis. And so our assumption has been that an understanding of mimesis in the 21st century benefits from joining philosophical and literary perspectives. If I can share my screen, I think that is the takeaway message of the image that we have selected for this conference. That is a bond of union by Escher that shows two entangled heads. They happen to be gendered because the Homo Mimeticus project added a gendered mimesis project, but it needed to be gendered necessarily. What I think we want to emphasize in this conference is that this tenuous link between the two heads is a link between philosophy and literature that opens up a multiplicity of perspective on a Homo Mimeticus that is driven by differences. And I should say, if you notice the faces and you study the faces, they're not too happy. So there are powerful forces that pull these lovers apart. There are disciplinary forces that tend to entrench a problematic that crosses disciplines within stable binaries. And thanks to the ERC support within Homo Mimeticus, we've done our best to establish connections between literature, philosophy, and other perspectives as well. So what I want to do as a welcoming and opening gesture is basically give you an outline of the project as an introduction, what we've been doing over the past 5 years, outline briefly what we mean with the mimetic turn, and then our ambition has been to create a new theory of mimesis and introduce new concepts in order to account for new manifestations of Homo Mimeticus in the 21st century, often in the company of influential figures. And you see some of them, our keynote speakers. We are quite honored to have Jane Bennett, Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen, Vittorio Gallese, and Bill Connolly as our keynote speakers, and so many invited speakers and participants to join forces in promoting this mimetic turn. So I was speaking of a journey, and the journey started officially in 2015 when I was invited to an ERC interview. And as you know, the ERC, the European Research Council, is this wonderful opportunity for researchers founded 15 years ago, roughly, that promotes innovation in science, often across disciplinary perspectives, in order to focus on problems more than disciplines. And naturally, it focuses on innovation. And so I must say, I didn't make my life all too easy as I decided to propose as an original concept, the concept of imitation. I was in a way too removed from the ideal of originality simply because of the topic of imitation, but because, of course, I'm not the first person to claim that humans are mimetic creatures. And yet, one of the assumptions of the Homo Mimeticus project is that an idea doesn't need to be necessarily new in order to be good. An idea that crosses 2000 years of history has a certain resilience, and I think benefits to be reworked and to be adapted to the present times. So methodologically, what we've been doing has been to look back genealogically to influential precursors in order to sit and push on their shoulders, if you want to use that ancient metaphor, and try to see further ahead. So that the mimetic turn is really a return. That is a return to thinkers that might have been marginalized very often across disciplines, and that help us think about the protean implications of being mimetic creatures and what it means to be mimetic in the 21st century. Now, any theory of mimesis worth its salt has to acknowledge at least two influential precursors, Plato and Aristotle, who obviously disagreed, you can see it from their hands, about the value of mimesis understood as an aesthetic representation. Plato violently critiqued it, even banned mimesis, not only for epistemological reasons, but because mimesis generates a pathos that spreads contagiously in the body politic, whereas Aristotle defended it, arguing that poetry is more philosophical than history, and perhaps mimesis even generates the catharsis of pity and fear. So they disagreed about mimesis understood as an aesthetic representation of reality. And we'll have panels devoted more specifically to Plato and Aristotle. But what we've been stressing over the past 5 years is that despite this fundamental disagreement, Plato and Aristotle fundamentally agreed that humans are mimetic animals, that we imitate with our bodies and thus with our minds, that we are Homo Mimeticus. And so that has been the central insight that we placed at the center of the Homo Mimeticus project, and that we explored with my team from 3 different but related perspectives. On the side of arts, we emphasize theatricality quite a bit because the theater gives mimesis its name. Mimesis, as you know, comes from mimos, which means mime or performance. We also paid attention to music and literature, of course. And among many figures, we always mentioned Oscar Wilde, who as a classicist sums up, I think, most neatly the general orientation of Homo Mimeticus, as he says that life imitates art more than art imitates life. And I think we see a plurality of ways in which this principle is currently restaged. Now, on the philosophical side, there are many influences, but I think it's fair to say that Nietzsche provides an immanent foundation for the theory of mimesis we have been developing. Nietzsche, in the Genealogy of Morals, argues, it's the first phrase of the Genealogy of Morals, that we remain unknown to ourselves. Wir sind uns unbekannt. One of the arguments we've been developing is that this lack of knowledge about ourselves has to do with our understanding of mimesis. And so Nietzsche encourages to develop a genealogy of Homo Mimeticus that includes a number of figures that I'll mention shortly. Now, on the social sciences front and on the world outside, I think we have all had ample occasions to see how mimes or actors have the power to influence, often people assembled in a crowd or online. The most spectacular example, of course, was from 2016 to 2020, so during a good part of the Homo Mimeticus project. And we've been paying attention to politics, even though that was not initially our intention. And also looking ahead to the future, we have been attentive to our current process of becoming post-human, especially our engagement with new technologies, and TV series like Black Mirror set up a mirror, I think, that requires new mimetic reflections or hyper-mimetic reflections in the 21st century. And I'll come to that in a moment. Now, during this project, we have had encounters, a number of encounters with influential figures and colleagues and friends. You see here a number of workshops that we have organized over the past 5 years with figures as diverse as Jean-Luc Nancy, Jean-Michel Rabaté, Bill Connolly, Christoph Wolff, Günter Gebauer, and Adriana Cavarero, most recently in relationship to the Gender Mimesis project. So we have had a lot of help, and we are grateful to all these supporters who encouraged us to develop our theory of Homo Mimeticus. And a number of publications have appeared. As PI of the Home project, I couldn't be happier with scientific results that have emerged. And what I'm happy about is not simply the quantity. Of course, quantity is important. We live in a quantitative world, but the fact that interdisciplinarity is a term that it's often mentioned and flagged, even in universities. But it's one thing to say it. It's another thing to publish in peer-reviewed interdisciplinary journals, because journals operate according to disciplinary standards. So doing interdisciplinarity practically means to be doing like decathlon. You need to be good at different sports with the same quality of the competitors in one field only. And we have been contributing in fields as diverse as continental philosophy, literary theory and literary studies, political theory, film studies, anthropology, sociology, and different perspectives. So I'm very proud of my team and on what we managed to achieve. I mentioned two special issues that are not out yet, but will be out this month. One of Countertext, titled The Mimetic Condition, which emerged out of a workshop with Günter Gebauer, and one specially shown Posthuman Mimesis with Journal of Posthumanism that emerged out of a conference on posthuman studies with Catherine Hales as a keynote speaker. So these are some of the outputs that emerged. I encourage you to navigate depending on your interest, and you can find them on the website. But then also such publications are only possible because of influential precursors having paved the way. And I cannot mention them all, but here are just some of the books that we've been reading and rereading and ruminating over the past 5 years. Derrida's Plato's Pharmacy and Double Session play an important role. Lucie Rigaret, absolutely central to our understanding of mimicry. René Girard, we devote a panel to Girard, and I'll come back to Girard in a moment. Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe, L'imitation des modernes, a book that unfortunately is still untranslated, and in my view is one of the best books on mimesis I've been reading over the years. There is this phrase by Lacoue-Labarthe who says, "Obligation nous est faite de penser et repenser la mimesis." And I think that that has been the phrase that we've been trying to put into action. But then also Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen books on psychoanalysis and mimesis. The Emotional Tie is a book that I highly recommend, and I look forward to hearing Mikkel speak tonight. The book by Günter Gebauer and Christoph Wolff, titled Mimesis, Culture, Art, Society, is an overarching overview of the history of mimesis from Plato and Aristotle to the present. And Matthew Tolsky's book, Mimesis, most recently as well, is a very good introduction. All these books emphasize the difference, the different potential of mimesis, but also mimesis as a human condition, an anthropological, political, affective condition, and we've been benefiting from this perspective. Now, what do we mean with the mimetic turn, or rather return to mimesis? Very schematically, what we have in mind is a shift of emphasis from the dominant notion of mimesis understood as representation towards a notion of mimesis as taking place in life, a mimetic life, or a vita mimetica, as we have been calling it recently. And that displacement or shift of emphasis implies a shift of attention for a notion of mimesis that tends to be devalued as a phantom of reality and tends to be thought in metaphysical terms in terms of likeness and copy that sets up a binary between the original and the model, towards a notion of a phantom ego that is driven by mimicry and mimetism. And that has been our focus, to shift attention from mimesis as a homoiosis or adequation to a metaphysical idea towards a notion of mimesis driven by metexis and participation that finds less in the visual arts, though we've been attentive to the visual arts in the model of the painter, that takes less the model of the painter as a starting point and more the theater and the mimos that drives it. Less focus on reproduction and more on production and the affective contagion that ensues. And if traditionally the focus has been on realism, mimesis as realism in classical texts like Auerbach, a famous study on mimesis, we've been promoting a notion of phantom ego or Homo Mimeticus, and it's a phrase that I borrow from Nietzsche in a book titled The Phantom of the Ego that provides the foundation for mimetic theory. Now, why is that important? Because we've seen phantom egos and affective contagion during the 5 years and much before. We've seen mimesis at its worst, Homo Mimeticus at its worst, and at its best, driven by sympathy and solidarity. And if the tendency is to downplay mimesis and its contagious power, when I was starting to work on this new fascist book, it was in 2015, I felt that the shadow, not fascism itself, but the shadow of fascism was re-emerging on the political scene, and it became visible in 2021. There is a certain advantage in paying attention to mimesis. But also, if you look at the current pandemic, we see conspiracy theories that are spreading virally online, and our first invited speaker, Michael Butter, will speak about that. But we also see the importance of models, right, in setting up examples to imitate. So we find mimesis going beyond good and evil repeatedly. And on that front too, thanks to Conrad's aesthetics, which has been attentive to pandemics, because he was a captain on board ship. And if you're on board a ship, again, a numeric image, then pandemics spread contagiously. I've been warning about the fact that the shadow of epidemics loom large again on the horizon as of 2016. So I mentioned these things just to emphasize the importance of rethinking mimesis with an eye to the present and maybe the future as well. And this is one of the definitions, if you ask yourself in the age of the death of theory, why theorize? Well, a definition by Michel Serres is that philosophie c'est anticiper. And it doesn't mean prediction. Of course, like the current war, I think few could predict that it would unfold so quickly. But it means to try to think, rely on a genealogy of thought in order to think the present with an eye to the future and pay attention to that. There is another definition of theory that has been important to the Home Project, and that comes from Nietzsche, who says that what dawns on philosophers is that they must no longer accept concepts as a gift, nor merely purify and polish them, but first make and create them. Philosophy as a creation of concepts, it's an idea that it's often attributed to Gilles Deleuze, but that finds a precursor in a figure like Nietzsche. And so that is indeed what we've been trying to do within the Homo Mimeticus project. So in the time that remains, I'll give you just the general contours of the birth of our Homo Mimeticus theory that emerges out of a mimetic agon. And it's a clin d'oeil to René Girard, who argues that mimesis is at play in our anthropological behavior, especially in our desires, and tends to lead to rivalries, which is true. And we'll see that there are ample occasions to confirm that view. But there is also a productive side to intellectual confrontations that we have been grouping under the rubric of the mimetic agon. And so I want to say a few words about that agon, specific agon with René Girard, who has been an important influence and source of inspiration. But I also think that need to be supplemented in the 21st century. Why? Because Girard emphasizes mimesis, I think, for very good reasons, as playing anthropological behavior, but restricts it to mimetic desire. And my sense as a genealogist of mimesis is that this is a theory that is very much indebted to the spirit of the time. It was the 60s, a theory overdetermined by a Freudian and Hegelian concern with the desire of the other, that leads to a bad form of mimesis that culminates in rivalry and violence and scapegoating mechanisms that are indeed very effective and still at play. So we should not underestimate this part of bad mimesis, and Girard is an important ally. But I think it's important to expand the mimetic theory. And in order to do that, we've introduced the concept of mimetic pathos, an ancient term that is often translated as affect, linked to suffering, but actually linked to all kinds of affects. And the source of inspiration here is once again Nietzsche, who defines the will to power as a pathos, not a being, not a becoming, but a pathos. And so the theory of mimesis that we've been developing is a Nietzschean modernist theory of mimesis that started 50 years after Girard, and that pays attention to both bad and good forms of imitation, because all affects, all pathos is contagious. And rather than developing a structure with universal ambitions, we have been attentive to a movement. And the movement of mimetic pathos, we notice by studying a number of figures, tends to oscillate pendulum-like between two opposed positions, between mimetic and anti-mimetic positions. So the Homo Mimeticus is open to mimetic pathos. We are vulnerable to contagion, to influence, and to all kinds of affects. But that doesn't mean that we cannot put ourselves at a distance from mimesis. The Nietzschean concept of pathos of distance comes in handy, uses it in the genealogy of morals in order to set up a distance between the anti-mimetic individual, often the sovereign, and the mimetic herd, to use an image that he often refers to. It's a mimetic image, but he calls it pathos of distance, indicating a tension and oscillation. And Nietzsche himself, I argue, is very vulnerable to the experience of mimesis. So that within the Homo Mimeticus project, we've been paying attention to this pendular movement of oscillation between, on the one hand, a phantom ego that is porous and relational and affectively inclined, but also, of course, the possibility to put ourselves at a critical distance and critique forms of mimetic behavior, crowd behavior. So to develop a pathos that is linked to a logos, or a logos that can reflect critically on mimetic pathos. And to that end, we set up this minimal, almost imperceptible distinction between the notion of pathology. Mimesis is a pathology. It's a view that is at play in Girard, but it's as old as Plato, and what we call a pathology, a critical logos on mimetic pathos. The source of this mimetic pathology is once again Nietzsche. There is a certain paradox of mimetic pathologies that we've been developing, and it's intimately linked to what he calls perspectivism. He says in Ecce Homo, to look from a morbid perspective towards healthier concepts and values, and again, conversely, to look down from the abundance and certainty of rich life into the secret labor of the instinct of decadence. That is what I have practiced most, meine längste Übung. And so we've been arguing that a passive vulnerability to mimetic pathos, or pathology, can actively be put to critical use to diagnose mimetic pathos, or pathologies. And the logos, the discourses, the accounts that we can mobilize are plural. In order to give you a schematic view of this dynamic, we could picture the ego as a phantom ego that is not closed, but it's open to the outside. It's driven by both affects and reason, both Homo Mimeticus and Homo sapiens, without a clear distinction between the two. And we are affected by pathologies. A viral pathology is a form of mimetic pathology. It spreads contagiously, but from self to other, but affects do so as well. And so we can transmit affects pathologically, and we see a number of manifestations of that. But there is also the possibility in a sort of feedback loop to turn this pathos into a source of inspiration to develop a critical logos on the pathos. And that is what we've been calling pathology. And we will see a number of manifestations of these plural pathologies in the conference, I believe. Now, the last concept that I want to introduce is the one of hyper-mimesis. We live in the digital age, and if you remember the Matrix, more than 20 years ago, Morpheus points out that we live in a world of simulacra and simulations. The Wachowski brothers were readers of Jean Baudrillard, Simulacre et Simulation, and if you study The Matrix, you'll even see the book within the film itself. There is a box book that Neo uses to hide his software that is mentioned in The Matrix. And that means that we can create simulacra that have nothing to do with reality, that are hyper-real, as Jean Baudrillard would say. And I'm using here a deep fake to illustrate this point. Now, for Baudrillard, the hyper-real has nothing to do with imitation. It's the map replacing the reality. So it does away, in an extreme Nietzschean gesture, I think, the distinction between the real world and the apparent one. But my sense is that the hyper-real retroacts on the bodies and psyches of Homo Mimeticus with real effects. So I give you just a couple of examples. A recent one is a deep fake of President Zelensky announcing that he's giving up the war. I advise you to lay down your arms and return to your families. This was happened a couple of weeks ago, not too long ago. And here we see that a hyper-real simulation that has nothing to do with reality, it's a digital construction, can generate real effects. So I think we can sense the danger of hyper-mimesis. And Zelensky is an interesting figure, is the figure that we are all following, and is someone who managed to move from the reality of a TV show. He was playing the president in a TV series, a popular TV series, prior to becoming president, indicating that the barrier between fiction and reality is a porous one, and that very often fictions, hyper-mimetic fictions, pave the way for realities. Now, it can be for the worse. We've seen it with Trump, and we've been writing about The Apprentice and how The Apprentice paved the way for Trump's election. In the case of Zelensky, we see it for the better. That is, a figure that emerges out of a TV fiction and manages to create a personality that stands up to authoritarian war and defend his country in the real world. Now, Zelensky is somebody who is trained in fiction, and if we study his speeches, we see how he's echoing previous speeches, Churchill's, for instance, most famously in the UK. But he also uses new media in order to convey specific messages, and I think that mimetic theorists should pay attention to that. So the current war in Ukraine is not only an empirical war of expansion that dates back to previous centuries, but it's also a war of information and misinformation, as we're all seeing. And Putin and Russia are very adept in generating simulations without any reference to reality. And so if we study the images of Zelensky when he's giving the speech, it's not only what he says, but how he presents himself, we see that he's very, very attuned to the problematic of mimesis. The similarity of the chair cannot be a coincidence. And if you read the message, the analogy between Morpheus denouncing a world of simulation without reference to reality, and Zelensky arguing for the defense of a world that is all too real, and yet it's denied by hyperreal or hypermimetic simulation, is there in the image itself. So as mimetic theorists, I think we have to pay attention not only to content, but also to the form. And of course, the effects of hypermimesis are real. And so we have seen it. As more than 4 million people are currently being displaced in the 54th days of war, I think our sympathy goes to the Ukrainian people, and the colors that we have selected for the program are there to indicate that. So 4 concepts: mimetic pathos, pathos of distance, pathologies, and hypermimesis. We have many more, but I think these are some that can maybe contribute to generating a return of attention to a different notion of mimesis that is at play today. If you want to know more, you've seen we have a website, and you can find out more about it. But I also want to stress, to conclude, that we were lucky during these 5 years to have wonderful supporters by incredible figures across disciplines. And the only reason that the Homo Mimeticus project was so successful was because we had these helpers and supporters and sources of inspiration. Because indeed, a turn or a return of attention requires a collective effort. It's not an individual effort. And we've been developing a number of video interviews with luminary figures in all kinds of fields, from literary theory with J. Hillis Miller to complexity theory, sociology, anthropology with Edgar Morin, political theory, Bill Connolly, anthropology, Christoph Wolff, Jean-Luc Nancy in philosophy, of course, and Adriana Cavarero in feminist philosophy. So we thought that during the break, you should have your coffee and relax, but maybe we show you excerpts of these videos so that you can see that we are in good company. And the company, of course, is continuing in the 3 days to come. As I said, we are honored to have such wonderful keynotes, Jane Bennett, Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen, Vittorio Gallese, and Bill Connolly, as well as a number of invited speakers and participants. And so I think that together we are ready to promote a mimetic turn or a return of attention to mimesis in order to think about the crisis of the present and the future. A last word of thanks to the ERC, who has been generously supporting us, making possible this transdisciplinary connection. My colleagues at KU Leuven, both in philosophy and in arts, and above all, my wonderful team, the Homo Mimeticus team and the gender mimesis team, Nikki, Marina, Carolina, Julia, Willow, Isabel. This has been a collective effort, and so it is with pleasure that now I turn the screen to my team, who will briefly introduce what we'll be doing over the next 3 days.